The day Kwame Asante walked into the Harrington and Cole boardroom, wearing a slightly faded blazer and carrying a Tim Hortons cup, 3 people laughed, not out loud. But Kwame had spent 41 years learning how to read a room, and he caught every single one of them. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a practiced smile, had asked him twice if he was sure he had the right floor. He told her yes both times, with the same quiet patience he used when his granddaughter asked him why the sky was blue. He wasn't angry. He'd been in enough rooms like this to know that anger was a tax only he would have to pay. Harrington and Cole Capital was the kind of firm that had its name embossed on everything: the elevator buttons, the coasters, the edge of the glass conference table. It sat on the 42nd floor of a tower in downtown Toronto, overlooking the lake on one side and the financial district on the other, and it operated with the specific confidence of an institution that had never once been told it was wrong. It managed close to $4 billion in assets. It had been founded in 1987 by 2 men whose grandsons now sat in corner offices, and for 17 years it had been quietly hemorrhaging money on a portfolio that everyone inside the building was too proud to admit was broken. Kwame Asante had not been invited to fix it. He had been invited because his firm, a small, deliberately low-profile investment advisory based out of a second-floor office on King Street West, had been quietly outperforming Harrington and Cole's flagship fund by nearly 11 points over the past 6 years. Someone on their board had finally noticed. Someone who wasn't a grandson. His name was listed on the meeting agenda as K. Asante, external consultant. Not partner, not advisor. External consultant, the kind of label that meant you were useful enough to hear from, but not important enough to sit at the head of the table. Kwame sat where they put him. Third seat from the end, facing the window, which meant the afternoon light came directly into his eyes and he'd have to squint to see the presentation screen. He adjusted his chair slightly to the left. He set down his coffee. He opened the notebook he'd carried since 1998, a plain brown Hilroy, the kind sold in drugstores, and uncapped his pen. The man across from him, Garrett Price, watched this with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to be offended or amused. Garrett Price was 44, tanned from a recent Turks and Caicos trip, and wore the kind of suit that cost more than most people's rent. He was the firm's senior portfolio director, a title he had inherited more than earned, and he had a habit of beginning sentences with "frankly" that Kwame had already cataloged in the first 3 minutes. "Frankly," Garrett Price said, leaning back in his chair, "I want to be transparent that this meeting is exploratory. We're not in the market for a full restructure." Kwame wrote the word exploratory in his notebook. Then he looked up and smiled, which was the one thing Garrett Price had clearly not expected. "Of course," Kwame said. The third person at the table was Sybil Wentworth, the firm's chief risk officer. She was in her late 50s, precise in the way that people who have survived long institutional careers become precise, and she had not laughed when Kwame walked in. She had simply watched him, the way a person watches something they haven't quite classified yet. The fourth was a junior analyst named Nathan Chu, who had been assigned to take notes, and had the look of someone who already suspected this meeting was going to be more interesting than advertised. Harrington and Cole's current portfolio strategy was outlined in a 40-slide deck that someone had clearly spent significant time on. The fonts were consistent. The graphs were clean. The logic, as Kwame worked through it, was a kind of magnificent circular reasoning. Each assumption propped up by the next, the entire structure resting on a foundational bet on interest rate stability that had stopped being reasonable somewhere around the second quarter of the previous year. It was the kind of thing that looked airtight until you pulled one thread. Kwame did not say this yet. He listened. He wrote in his notebook. He asked 2 questions, both of which were so specific that Nathan Chu stopped typing and looked up. Garrett Price answered both questions with the confidence of a man who had confused fluency for understanding. Kwame nodded and wrote down the answers verbatim. After the presentation, there was coffee, the expensive kind, served in small cups with saucers, very different from the Tim Hortons he'd carried in, and a general milling around period where people said words like synergy and alignment without appearing to notice they were doing it. Sybil Wentworth found him by the window. "You haven't said much," she said. "The deck was thorough," Kwame said. She looked at him for a moment. "You don't think it's going to work?" It was not a question. "I think," Kwame said carefully, that the assumptions made in slides 11 through 14 depend on a rate environment that no longer exists, and I think the exposure in the infrastructure segment is about 3 times what your risk documentation suggests it is. Sybil Wentworth was quiet for a long moment. How did you get to that number? The same way I always do, Kwame said. I read everything, including the footnotes. She almost smiled. Garrett won't want to hear that. I know, Kwame said. That's usually how it goes. What Kwame Asante did not talk about in boardrooms, because it was not relevant in boardrooms, was where he had come from. He had grown up in Brampton, the second of 4 children, in a house where his mother worked nights at a hospital laundry, and his father drove a bus for the city until his knees gave out. There was enough money for what mattered, and very little left over for what didn't. Kwame had been the kind of child who read the newspaper before school, not because anyone told him to, but because the numbers on the business page were a kind of puzzle he couldn't leave alone. At 16, he'd started tracking stocks in a composition notebook with no money to invest, just watching, learning how the patterns moved. He had gone to York on a partial scholarship, studying economics, and then spent 3 years at a mid-sized firm downtown learning that the industry had a very specific image of who belonged in it, and that image did not include him. He was passed over for promotions with explanations that were technically about performance, but were, in the way these things always are, about something else entirely. He left with no bitterness, or rather, he converted the bitterness into something more useful. And in 2004, he and 2 colleagues started Asante Capital Partners in an office with second-hand furniture and a coffee machine that worked half the time. 20 years later, that office had better furniture. The coffee machine was still temperamental. Kwame had never replaced it because, he said, it kept people humble. Asante Capital Partners managed just under $800 million. It was not a name most people recognized at dinner parties. Kwame had designed it that way. His clients were a mix of pension funds, family offices, and a handful of endowments. People who had found him by reputation and stayed because his record spoke so plainly that it didn't need decoration. He did not have a social media presence. He did not attend galas. He gave 1 interview per year, always to a publication that his clients actually read, and he answered every question with the same measured honesty that made journalists slightly uneasy because it left them nothing to push against. He had been married for 31 years to a woman named Dorothy who taught high school mathematics in Mississauga and had never once pretended to find finance interesting. They had 2 daughters. One was a family doctor in Halifax. The other was finishing a PhD in environmental science at UBC. Kwame paid for nothing in his daughters' lives that they hadn't asked him to pay for. He had opinions about this that Dorothy mostly agreed with. None of this was on the bio that Harrington and Cole had received. His bio was 4 lines: name, firm, years in operation, returns. He had learned a long time ago that the more you explained yourself to people who had already decided what you were, the more ammunition you handed them. The call came 6 days after the meeting. It was Garrett Price, which surprised Kwame slightly. He had expected it to be Sybil Wentworth or possibly someone from their board. But it was Garrett, and Garrett's voice had shifted into a register that Kwame recognized as a man who had been told to make a call he didn't want to make. "We've reviewed your notes," Garrett said. "The ones you sent over." After the meeting, Kwame had sent a 3-page memo. Not a proposal, he was careful about that word. A memo outlining what he had observed and what he believed the data suggested. He had written it the same night, sitting at his kitchen table while Dorothy graded tests, and the news played quietly in the background. "We'd like to bring you in more formally," Garrett said. "As an advisor on the restructure." Kwame said, "I appreciate that." There was a pause. "We'll need to discuss scope and compensation." "Of course," Kwame said. Another pause, longer this time. The board was impressed with the infrastructure analysis, particularly the footnote work. Kwame did not say, "I told you so." He wrote it in his notebook, which served the same purpose without the cost. "Happy to continue the conversation," he said. What Garrett Price did not say, and what Kwame understood anyway, was that the firm had quietly run his numbers through their own modeling after the meeting and found that his infrastructure projection was off by less than half a point, that he had identified an exposure using only publicly available documents that their own risk team, with full internal access, had missed, that Sybil Wentworth had gone to the board directly, which was the kind of thing that didn't happen often, and that the board had listened. Garrett Price had been in that meeting when Kwame walked in with his Tim Hortons and his worn blazer and his drugstore notebook. He had been one of the three who almost laughed. Now he was making this call. Kwame let him make it. The restructure took 7 months. It was not simple work. Harrington and Cole had layers of decisions stacked on top of each other, the way old houses accumulate modifications. Each one made sense at the time, but together they created something that was both structurally unsound and very difficult to navigate. Kwame came in twice a week, sat in a smaller conference room than the first one, and worked through it methodically. He brought Nathan Chu into most of the sessions, partly because Nathan was sharp, and partly because Nathan was the only person in the building who had started listening early. Garrett Price attended the early sessions with the energy of a man defending territory he wasn't sure he still owned. He raised objections that were sometimes valid and sometimes were simply objections. Kwame engaged with all of them with equal seriousness because dismissing even a bad faith question was a waste of time, and because sometimes a bad faith question had a real answer worth finding. Sybil Wentworth was in most sessions too. She asked different kinds of questions, the ones that were trying to understand rather than resist, and she had a way of synthesizing information that Kwame found genuinely useful. She had been at the firm for 22 years. She knew where the bodies were buried, as the expression goes, and she understood that the restructure needed to account for institutional memory as much as financial logic. By the 4th month, something had shifted in the room. Kwame noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, not a single moment, but a gradual turn. Garrett Price stopped beginning sentences with frankly. He started asking Kwame's opinion before offering his own. Nathan Chu had started bringing his own notebook, a plain black one from Staples, and he wrote in it constantly. The infrastructure portfolio was the hardest part. The exposure Kwame had identified turned out to be, when they fully unpacked it, closer to 4 times the documented level. There was a period of about 2 weeks where the firm's board was very quiet in a way that meant they were frightened, and Kwame simply kept working. He had seen this before. Fear was not the enemy. The decisions you made because of fear were the enemy. He restructured the exposure in stages, working with Sybil Wentworth on the risk documentation, flagging what needed to be disclosed and what was already within acceptable bounds. He was precise about this. There was a version of this work where you protected the firm by obscuring the problem, and Kwame did not do that version. He had a practice and a reputation that he had built over 20 years by never doing that version, and he was not going to start at 43 floors above the lake in a building with its name on the elevator buttons. The board noticed this too. The formal presentation happened on a Thursday in October, when the lake outside the window had gone the color of old pewter, and the city had started its annual negotiation with the cold. Kwame presented to the full board. 12 people, most of them older, most of them white, all of them carrying the particular weight of people who are responsible for other people's money. He had spent 3 days preparing the presentation. It was 22 slides. The fonts were consistent. The graphs were clean. But unlike the firm's own deck from 7 months earlier, the logic held up when you pulled the thread. He walked them through what he had found, what had been done about it, and what the projected impact would be over the next 18 months. He used plain language. He did not use the word synergy. He did not use the word alignment. When someone asked a question he didn't have the answer to, he said he didn't have the answer to it yet and wrote it down. Garrett Price sat to the left of the board chair. Kwame noticed that he did not fidget the way he had in the first meeting. He sat straight and listened, and once, when a board member challenged a point that Kwame had made about the rate environment, Garrett Price said, quietly but audibly, "He's right about that," and then said nothing else. It was, Kwame thought, one of the more graceful things he had seen in a boardroom. After the presentation, the board chair, a woman in her 70s named Constance Aldwin, who had founded one of the first female-led venture funds in Canada in the 80s and then quietly joined boards for the next 2 decades, asked Kwame to stay behind. The room emptied. Constance Aldwin poured herself a glass of water and sat across from him, which was different from the dynamic of the formal presentation. It felt like a conversation between 2 people rather than an assessment. "You knew in the first meeting," she said. "The infrastructure exposure. I had a strong suspicion," Kwame said. "And you didn't say it then." "I had been in the room for 90 minutes, Kwame said. Nobody asked." Constance Aldwin looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone revisiting a decision. "We should have asked sooner," she said. "And we should have brought you in differently." It was as close to an apology as a board chair of a $4 billion firm was going to come, and Kwame received it the way he received most things, without performance, without dismissal. "These things take the time they take," he said. She almost smiled. "You're more patient than I would be." "It's not patience exactly," Kwame said. He thought about his mother working nights in the hospital laundry. He thought about his father's knees and the bus route he drove for 22 years. He thought about the promotions that went to other people, and the office with the second-hand furniture, and the coffee machine that still didn't fully work. "It's more that I learned a long time ago to let the work speak. Because when it speaks, people listen eventually, and when they listen, they actually hear it." Constance Aldwin nodded slowly. "We'd like to propose a formal ongoing relationship," she said, "not as an external consultant, as a strategic partner, retained with board access." Kwame picked up his pen and opened his notebook to a fresh page. "Tell me what that looks like," he said. The news moved through the firm the way news always moves through firms, sideways, in hallways, in the margins of other conversations. By the following Monday, everyone in the building knew that Kwame Asante had been offered a strategic partnership. Most people received this information and moved on. A few did not. Garrett Price found him in the elevator bank late on a Tuesday afternoon. "I wanted to say something," Garrett Price said. Kwame waited. "The way I handled the first meeting," Garrett started again. "I made some assumptions. About what you were coming in to do. About who you were." He did not finish the sentence in the way that would have made it specific, and Kwame did not push him to. Some acknowledgments were still worth receiving even when they were incomplete. "Appreciate that," Kwame said. The elevator came. Garrett Price got in. Kwame did not. He had left his notebook upstairs. He watched the doors close and stood for a moment in the quiet of the elevator bank, 42 floors above the city. He thought about Nathan Chu, who had started his own notebook. He thought about Sybil Wentworth, who had gone to the board when she knew something was wrong. He thought about Constance Aldwin saying we should have brought you in differently, and meaning it. He thought about the first meeting, and the 3 people who almost laughed. And then he went back upstairs to get his notebook because he still had work to do. 6 weeks after the partnership was formalized, the firm's flagship fund posted its strongest quarterly return in 11 years. Kwame was not in the building when the numbers came in. He was in his office on King Street West, at his desk by the window going over a position report with a cup of coffee from the machine that never fully worked. His phone buzzed with a message from Sybil Wentworth. Numbers in. It worked. He set down his phone and looked out the window for a moment at the street below. The ordinary King Street afternoon, people moving in the cold, a streetcar going past, the city doing what cities do. Then he opened his notebook to a fresh page, picked up his pen, and kept working. Because that's what you do when you've been building something for 20 years that most people couldn't see until the moment they couldn't ignore it. You don't stop to celebrate the moment they finally looked up. You were already 3 steps ahead. You had always been 3 steps ahead. The Tim Hortons cup was still on his desk. He hadn't thrown it out.